Hello and welcome to another video of the Alalibo Academy. I am Phil, and today we are looking at the impact of the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 on Africa. Now, the Berlin Conference really was an important conference in the history of Africa because this was the conference where the continent was colonized, essentially, where the European powers determined how to colonize the continent, who to colonize what part of the continent, when to start the colonization of the continent. So this was a very important conference. And this conference specifically started in November 1884 and continued until February 1885. Now, we are talking about 4 months, a 4-month period to determine how, when to colonize an entire continent. So that determination was made in Berlin, in faraway place, Berlin, thousands of miles away from Africa, determining the fate of a continent. Now let's take a look at this closely. Now, how many countries participated in this conference? There were a total of 14 countries, and we have those countries here. So 14 countries participated in this conference, and those countries are Austria, Hungary, one country at a time, Belgium, you have Denmark, France, you have Germany, Great Britain, you have Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and Norway, one country at a time. They were unified from 1814 to 1905 before they became independent as separate countries, Turkey and the United States. Now, these two countries were represented by ambassadors. The other countries were represented by either their leaders or very high-level representation. These were the countries that came together to determine the fate of a continent in a faraway place as Berlin. Now, not all of these countries actually had colonies in Africa. For example, Russia did not come to Africa as a colonizing power. We have other countries such as Sweden, Norway, did not do so as well. But nevertheless, most of these countries did come to the continent and had a presence on the continent for decades and had impact on the continent in a very negative way. And so let's take a look at this impact then. There were three main impacts this conference had on the continent. The first one is geographical distribution. And here we mean the allocation of boundaries, right? That's what this means, the allocation of boundaries. So here we say boundaries or borders, and the boundaries or borders were arbitrary. They were created at whim. There was no logic to it, no rationale to it, and in some cases they divided communities, and just drew a line in the middle of the community. So one community belongs to one country, the other part of the community belongs to another country, and in some cases they speak different languages because to different colonizing countries were engaged in this division. And so the geographical distribution was very, very irrational, illogical, did not make sense, and divided the country based on political considerations. And that has significant impact on the continent as well, because again, it divided the continent essentially. As I said previously, the communities were divided, ethnicities were divided. People that belonged to the same ethnicity suddenly found themselves in 2 different countries, and in some cases, 3 different countries, speaking different languages suddenly. That had tremendous impact on the continent. Now, the second impact is the linguistic landscape. As we can see, the major colonizers, which were France, Britain, and Portugal, right, and even Belgium to some extent, and the Dutch Netherlands was there as well. You can see their languages are really dominant on the continent. So, for example, you have the biggest country in the continent in terms of population, Nigeria, speaks English. English is the official language of this country. And you have other big countries like Ghana as well, speaking English. You have Liberia speaking English as well, etc. And you have also big countries speaking French, like Mali, for example. Niger and Mali, for example. You have countries like Mauritania speaking French as well. and even extending to Algeria speaking French and Morocco speaking French, right? And so you have this division. Right within the West African region, you have several countries speaking French and several countries speaking English, which was not the case when before the the colonizing powers came to Africa. So the linguistic landscape really eroded the culture, right? So essentially diminished, right? Diminished the culture of the continent, right? Because when we talk about language, language is culture, and culture is language. And when you take away the language of a people, you kill the culture. And that's essentially what was happening. And they introduced their language. Their language became the medium of expression and the medium of instruction. And by so doing, the younger generation will lose connection with the language. In any society, not just in Africa, that is the case. So the linguistic landscape was had a tremendous impact on the continent, dividing the continent many, many levels. And here in Angola, you had Portuguese being spoken. In Mozambique, you had Portuguese being spoken as well, because these two were colonized by Portugal. And then also you have a pocket of a country here called Guinea-Bissau, also speaking Portuguese. So in one continent, you have English, you have French, you have Portuguese. You also have Spanish being spoken, especially in Equatorial Guinea, where it is one of the official languages as well. And this was the impact it had on the continent, because now they were speaking foreign languages when they had their own language. Each country and each community had their own language. But now they found themselves speaking foreign language, and of course further eroding the culture, especially amongst the young ones. And when that happens, an entire community loses their identity. And that is the connection here. They lose their identity once the language is gone. And they pick themselves on francophone, anglophone lines, which is totally wrong in this context. Now, the third and final impact, of course, there are more impacts, but the ones we're highlighting here are key impacts: is psychological torture of losing your language, psychological torture of losing members of your community, relatives, in many cases, close relatives, being lost and sent to other countries, essentially, and creating a political boundary between them, essentially building a wall between them, where now visa was required before the relatives can see each other, and they have to do the border formalities and so forth. That was psychological torture and continues to be psychological torture. So the first two impacts represent psychological torture on Africans. They're losing their culture, losing their identity, they're losing their relatives, losing their families, and that cannot be a good thing for the continent. And this is what we mean by the impact of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 on the continent. It had tremendous impact on the continent by way of geographical distribution, language, barriers, psychological torture as part of the mix, not to mention the loss of their natural resources and their land in many cases, and the political oppression that came with colonization. So this conference set the stage for colonization, and this is why it's so important in the history of the continent.